Dr. Miller, thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast. Appreciate it. Most people watching and listening should know who you are, but could you give us a little brief introduction about yourself and your ministry?
Yeah. Well, first of all, call me Sharon.
Okay, will do.
I'm kind of from the old school where you only call someone a doctor if you're in a college or university setting, but otherwise,
fair enough. I plan on doing that the rest of the time, but I at least want to acknowledge up front you do have a PhD.
That's very kind and honoring. So I'm in Durham, North Carolina, and I lead Bright City Church with my husband, Ike. And we're actually about to celebrate our 3rd anniversary. So awesome. Our church is about 3 years old, which means we have spent more than half the life of our church in a pandemic.
That's right.
So there's that.
That's right.
There's that. So I'm the teaching pastor of our church. And then I also write. I have 2 books, and I just actually turned in the manuscript for my 3rd. So that will be coming out next August.
Okay.
And then most importantly, I am a mom, and I have 3 kids aged 9, 6, and 3. So we have 2 boys and a girl. And our daughter is basically in charge of my husband. Whatever she says is what he's doing.
Sounds about right. Is she the oldest, the middle, or the youngest?
She's the youngest. She's
the youngest. Wow.
And
a lot of sway there.
Yeah, definitely. We're really, but she's also, she's so cute. She's so cute. And so we're all just goners. We can't say no. We're all just helpless because she's just the cutest thing ever. So
that's awesome. That's definitely how we feel about our 2-year-old Deacon. Mm-hmm. He definitely has everyone doing whatever he wants or needs. So for this episode today, we're talking about the seemingly ever-present divide of generations understanding one another. People tend to joke about it, say cliche things like, well, back in my day, or when would those kids learn? But I feel like along with satire, has underlying truth and reality in how they actually feel. People also might think young people today with their technology and how they react, they're so selfish and ignorant. But those of us who might look down at younger generations, or really any other generation aside from our own, with any amount of disdain, should be aware of how we have contributed to the things that we complain about and dislike. So Sharon, let's start with the big picture. Do you feel like the current generational divides are wider and more intense than they have been from your experience and what you've seen? Or do you feel like just because of the all ever-present internet, we're just being inundated with it more, and so we see it more? What do you think is the actual truth there?
Yeah, so much of this, because I'm not a sociologist, this is mostly my perspective, as a pastor, and we're in a college town. And so we have 3 major universities and then some smaller colleges as well. And so we have a lot of young people around here. But my impression is that the divide is not new at all. Maybe it's dividing along different lines and in different ways. But, you think back to the 60s and the 70s, and you think how different those were from the 50s, and how, hippies, how people thought hippies were just, godless and, liberal. And, it seems like there's every generation, the older folks look back on the younger folks and say, the world is just going, down the drain because of these young people. And really it's just, the world has changed, in different ways. And even just looking back, when we look back on the 50s, which, seemed like such a wholesome time in so many ways, but was also a really dark period in terms of racism. And so, yes, from one perspective, it was very wholesome and very Christian and, very moral, except for this giant gaping immorality in our country that no one was, talking about. So I imagine, the ways that we divide are probably just in different ways, but I definitely don't feel like this is new. at all. I think you are probably right. Just maybe we're able to see it more, but even in that, I have a sense that older people 30 years ago probably looked at younger people and thought, oh no,
No,
what's going to happen?
Yeah, I would agree. And I think the answer to my question might kind of be a both and, because there's so much that is happening to us regardless of our generation because of just what we're seeing and being exposed to. I've heard people said, I've heard people say, and I've read people talk about how no wonder we all have so much anxiety. We're not built to know and learn what's happening to everyone all the time. It's just so much. And also I feel like because of how everything is moving now from analog to digital, that, Gen Z and also Gen Alpha behind them, these are the generations that didn't have AOL pop up when they're in junior high, kind of like I did. They've only known technology. And so I feel like that has staying power because of how much of a shift it has created in culture and any kind of paradigm and things like that. So it's kind of like, yes, there are big changes. I love how, the world is always changing. In fact, Jesus promised that it's going to keep changing and probably actually getting worse until I come back. And so there's a lot of things to be aware of how we're being influenced and how we're responding. But yeah, I mean, you think about the hippies that came out of the 50s. I think that's adding to the obvious huge thing that's really important to bring up as much as we can in racism and really acknowledging history, not just this history or that history.
Well, and I was talking just the other day, I talked to my mother-in-law about this a lot because she gets very concerned, and she was talking about how fewer and fewer people, are going to church and just how concerning that is. But even that has been cyclical. When we look back on American history, there have been other times, like 100 years ago, when there wasn't a high percentage of people that were regularly going to church. And we tend to think that Christian has always been this deeply, deeply religious nation, Christian nation. And in some sense, that is true. But it has been cyclical, and that's why you have these revivals all of a sudden where there's this, surge in spirituality. And so I think that knowing that as well, that this isn't the first time that we've seen an ebb or a flow. This isn't the first time that our country has experienced division. There's nothing new under the sun. So that's really encouraging to remember.
Yes, definitely. And, adding to that cycle, I think what we're going to talk about here a little bit too is, how we've contributed to things that we see. And so we talk about how the 50s are glorious and golden, but what came right after that, the children of the 50s are the hippies. And these people, it's like, oh, wait a minute. If this was really great, then how come this contributed to what those same adults now like despise and complain about? And so we have a big influence, a huge influence in how the next generation thinks about things, receives things, contemplates things, values things. So, I think this follow-up question might get us to where most people are like, okay, as a youth worker or even as a believer, what's my job and what's my role? So what roles do you think Christians have played in generational divides, both maybe beneficial to make distinctions, but also detrimental? What do you think?
Yeah, I think any time Christians are not taking into account the way that history has that sort of trickle down effect, we end up being really judgmental towards and condescending towards younger people instead of understanding what were the cultural factors that shaped them. So one example of this, in my first book, my first book is called Free of Me, Why Life is Better When It's Not About You. And it's about self-forgetfulness. But I look in one of the earliest chapters at the self-esteem movement and how it is, very much on the importance of affirmation and reminding people that they are special and that they can do anything. And millennials, especially, I have become sort of the whipping post for that movement and blamed that, now look how fragile they are. Look how, not resilient they are because of this thinking. But when I was writing the book and researching it, I learned that the self-esteem movement began with boomers. That's where it started. And it seems a little bit unfair for it to begin with boomers, but then for boomers to be sort of looking back and blaming the generation that was shaped, fundamentally by it.
Yep.
And so I think we need to have more humility, in looking at young people and understanding that this wasn't just a rotten generation that was born out of nowhere and, they spoiled themselves. And we can now stand over them in judgment. And so I think there's humility with that, but there's also the bigger picture of knowing that whatever trend we are buying into now, and this is really sobering to me, is we won't see the impact of it possibly for 20, 30 years. I was just talking to my husband about this with, a lot of the conversations around gender and sexuality in our secular culture. And I said, this is all kind of an experiment, and we won't really know the fallout for 30 years. And we can all guess at what that will be, but none of us really knows. And so that is also really humbling and really sobering. So my overall takeaway from that is simply to be less finger wagging about, any given generation and how, what all their problems are, but instead consider, what have we done, to contribute to it. And also how have we been shaped, in ways that are maybe different, better or worse than generations past.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we can only respond to what we experience and see. And obviously different generations are going to experience things differently. It's going to shape them differently. A prime example, at least right now when we're recording this past weekend was the 20th anniversary of 9/11. I have an exact picture. I know exactly what that day looked like from the beginning of the day all throughout. I made sure to go buy the Arizona Republic paper on September 12th, and I still have it. And just thinking about how that shaped me and people I know, and yet, most of my students now don't remember it, or maybe some of the older ones who just graduated, might remember their parents reacting and things happening, but they weren't really affected as I was, or as you were, or people older as well. So it's good for us to keep in mind, like, we also, older generations, we have a lot more hindsight than younger ones. And so that's part of why, the whole model of how to teach, we've been there. And so we know some of the pitfalls. Parenting, the same thing. Okay, I'm gonna let you figure that out. Oh, you realize that's not good. Good. I'm glad you realized that, right? Because they can only hear us say that so much. They have to experience it. But how are we going to walk with them? And in this case, with this next generation and how they experience things. And I love that you brought up the resiliency. And for millennials, and definitely for Gen Z and older generations, talking about how, they're a bunch of snowflakes, they can't handle this or handle that. And it's like, well, why don't you look at it from their perspective of maybe they're actually being willing to deal with things and be vulnerable that are mentally or emotionally unhealthy, that your generation pushed down and didn't deal with, and it's come out in different ways that's hurt other people that you haven't realized. And so it's really good for us to say, I'm not sure I like that, or that doesn't seem right to me, but just think about if you were in their shoes, or since I didn't do that, how am I different? And it's good for us to have really good awareness. And I think awareness and humility are the two big things that keep popping up.
And then, and I would also say a redemptive imagination for what the current cultural climate, how we can raise our kids in it to be prepared for what is coming, instead of sheltering them from it.
Yes.
Because I think that's the other thing, that because things are so different, there's a lot of unknowns and it can feel really scary. I think the temptation is to want to shield your children from that, as much as possible. And so just to give you an example, that I thought this was so interesting. I was on Facebook this morning and I saw a friend of mine who, she and her husband also lead a church plant, and she was sharing that her child at school had been sharing about Jesus on the playground. And I don't know what they were saying exactly, but the teacher had said, you need to be careful about that. Not everyone has the same beliefs as you. And so we need to be careful about talking about Jesus to people in a way that could feel insensitive. And so the mother was, sharing about this experience, and she was mostly sharing just to say that she was really proud of her child for being so fearless and sharing the gospel. But what was really interesting was the responses. And I was noticing how a number of people said, maybe you should consider taking your child out of that school and putting them in a Christian school. And, there's reasons for being in public school, versus private school. That's a whole other conversation. But I thought it was really fascinating that the response to some people of your child encountering the world with the gospel, I mean, that child was doing evangelism, was to say, oh, let's take them out of there and put them into this environment where it's almost entirely Christian, instead of asking, like, how can I walk alongside my child to prepare them so that when they leave the house, they are prepared for the actual world. And so that's something that I and my husband, we think about a lot, is not thinking, how do we simply protect our kids from the world? Because the world is scary. We do want to protect our kids. But even, with the pandemic, I think there's a lot of despair over what this is, doing to our kids. And I try and think of it very differently as, how can this be sowing resiliency into our kids? Like, how could they be better and stronger and not the snowflake, when they're adults, because they grew up in a pandemic. And so I think there's actually a lot of hope. We have a resurrection at the center of our gospel.
Right.
And so we should feel a lot of hope because of that. And so I think that's a really important perspective as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And I know people watching, listening, the school setting, there's so much that goes into that. Being in Texas, I'm pretty sure maybe it's because of how big Texas is, but also I think we're the biggest state as far as the amount of homeschooled kids. There's a lot of homeschooling that goes on in Texas, and not saying it's bad, not saying it's a great, like, I'm just bringing it up, but also I think it's pretty clear, and I think a lot of homeschooling parents would agree, that a big reason why a lot of the homeschooling goes on, especially if it's a Christian home, I think a decent component in that is the shielding. And as parents, there are things we do want to shield our kids from. There's a reason why we don't put on certain movies and whatever else for our 2-year-olds. There's a reason for that. But also, so my wife has a really good perspective on that, because I think she, from preschool through high school, she was public, private, and homeschooled all in that. Like, she had different phases. Some a lot shorter than others. Yeah, some a lot shorter than others. But her perspective on a lot of that has been really helpful, especially as we consider the future for our son and really how we interact with students. I've always had a conglomeration of those 3 students in our youth group, and it's a smaller church, and so some of those characteristics become more evident. But it's interesting to see how people react to the cultural warfare, and and that's something else that we could fill multiple other podcast episodes with, is the whole us versus them mentality, and how that's anti-gospel. The gospel is about reconciliation. And so, yeah, there's a lot that goes into seeing adversity. Oh, you should protect your kid and put him in this role. And, I wonder how much of that plays into with parents who are reacting that way to what happened, is thinking back to maybe when they were kids and they would do something and their parents would do something that child would think like is an overreaction, but yet maybe they're making the same things now. So they're being shaped by things that when they were younger, it's like, well, this doesn't make sense. And some of that has to do with age and experience, but doesn't invalidate the perspective of the younger people. So we have to consider all that.
Yeah. So I know you didn't anticipate having, like a discussion about private school versus public school, but I think, every family is different. Every kid is different. There's so many different issues to weigh in, but not having, I think the important thing is preparing your children to go out into the world and make disciples.
Yes.
And not in an embattled posture, but in an incarnational one. And I think that's the name of the game. However you do it, there's more than one way, but making sure that we are preparing our children to be disciples in the actual world.
Yes, that's right. Yep. Yeah. And that's the benefit of being the maverick. Everything's in my wheelhouse. So don't worry about rabbit trails. They're just awesome opportunities to talk about other things. So being able to process how generational divides and when we were younger and now how that's shaped us, that's important to consider. So let's stay with that theme. So how should believers, especially for our audience, our context, those who work with children and youth, the next generation, how should we be stepping into the fray of that generational warfare as messengers of hope and reconciliation that Scripture says we are to be?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, because I'm not a youth pastor, I'm sure everything I'm about to say is nothing new for anyone who's been in youth ministry for any amount of time. But I think empathy and compassion has got to be, the name of the game. I remember when we first planted, and we have a lot of college students at our church. And one thing that I started noticing right away was the anxiety. Our students have so much anxiety.
So much.
And I was really stunned by this because I went to college in this area. So I went to undergrad and graduate school at Duke. And Duke is intense. It's a very intense, academically intense school. And so I knew about stress. But I graduated a long time ago and things have changed since then. And I was really shocked to see the level of anxiety now is unlike anything I experienced during my undergrad. And I know it's not because school is harder now. That's not why. And so I was, paying attention to this and asking questions. And every now and then I would sort of speculate and say, maybe it's this, maybe this is why. And it was never received well. When I would try and say, from my years of experience, well, maybe it's just this, like maybe you need to, just change this, or maybe it's this perspective, or maybe it's our culture, whatever it is. And it was not, I think our students, whenever I would say that, they just didn't feel seen or really understood. And to some extent, they might've even felt talked down to a little bit. And I think that's when we, what is the phrase, like armchair quarterback, when we try and kind of do that with young people, it doesn't go well. Like we're not pastoring them well when we do that. And so that's something that I would assume is also true for youth as well, is to not necessarily give explanations and all of our, years of wisdom for why, this cultural phenomenon is happening, but instead try to be empathetic and compassionate and to like deeply, deeply understand, how they are feeling. to truly listen. I mean, that's something too that our culture is so terrible at, is listening. We are not a listening culture.
Yep, totally agree.
And that's something that we as a church have really come through a season where my husband did something called the Listening Initiative, where he would get together with different people in our church and he would ask them questions about kind of hot button issues and just ask, where are you on this? How are you feeling about it? And he wouldn't give any response at all. He would literally just sit, listen, and take notes. And that's all he did. And then he did a sermon series on listening afterwards, and how Jesus was such a good listener. People always came away from him, when they came to him in earnest and in real pain, they never left feeling unheard by Jesus. And how important it is in a culture of noise and constant overstimulation, and that generational divide where we do think we know better than young people. How important it is for the church to listen to people in their pain. Yes. And to me, that seems to be one of the most important things that we can do right now.
I love it. Yeah, I completely agree with all of that. And this generation, Gen Z, as of now, I love the studies that Barna has. I both have Gen Z Volume 1 and Volume 2, and I've used those for different things. But so Gen Z, biggest generation ever, most anxious generation ever. And Kara Powell talked about from Fuller Youth Institute how in the pandemic, depending on age group and geography and things, anxiety and depression have tripled or even quadrupled with like 18 to 20 or 13 to 23-year-olds, something like that. And yeah, there's a lot. And I think a lot of it has to do with these. But you're right. Some things like Duke is always going to be challenging and other things are going to be, but I think it's because because now what we see everyone doing, I tell my students all the time, being here in Texas where it's so big and so there's a lot to compete with academically, and how when I did internships in Florida or did something else, like you would have students with AP and dual credit courses, they would have like something obnoxious, like a weighted 4.8 GPA, and they can't get into the college that they want. It's like, that would give you anxiety. You've had parents or whoever else, like, you need to get good grades, and you put that on yourself, and you get to this point and you really haven't done anything that would disqualify you. You're just being told that you're not good enough. And wow, and throw that in with you're instantly and forever judged by 144 characters or however much it is on Twitter for one thing that you said. That's it. That's who you are. And I'm so glad that we didn't grow up with social
I know,
media.
because I know adults who can't handle that. I know adults who frequently have to take social media breaks because it weighs them down and shrinks their souls and just irritates their insecurities. And so to expect 14, 15-year-olds to be able to handle it, it's just, and I think that's another reason why we do need to have humility and compassion. Is the truth is we didn't grow up that way. Right. And so it's really arrogant to think that we can stand over them and say, I know better. Preach. When we didn't grow up that way. Right. We didn't grow up that way. And so I think, humility is the name of the game. Compassion, empathy are the name of the game. And that doesn't mean I think nothing matters, that like, truth and wisdom, don't go out the door, but that our starting point needs to be our own limited experience with this.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think in this context, we're really talking about, pushing against the extremes of they'll get over it or what's wrong with them. Or you're right, because we don't have that personal experience. And so empathy and compassion are certainly needed for that. So let's wrap up with some words of wisdom, inspiration, some encouraging things that you've seen in your years of ministry, traveling, speaking, engaging with people. Sharon, what are some stories you've heard or settings you've been in where you've seen healthy and encouraging partnership and unity between different generations?
You know, I am encouraged, honestly, by my own church and being in a college town. And we have college students are really involved, you know, in the churches here. But honestly, one thing that is really encouraging to me, I was talking to one of our young people who, I guess she would be Gen Z. She's out of college now, but I think she would be Gen Z. I think. What is the cutoff? What's the oldest Gen Zers?
I think 98 from most things I've read, 98 or so, 97, 98.
She's like 23. So I think she's Gen
I'm terrible
Z.
at math, so you need to help me.
I am too. I can't do math. I was an English, religion major, English minor.
It's 2021. So yeah, so 23, she would be right at the cutoff.
Okay, she's like right there.
So she's millennial Z. Yeah.
Okay. I'm so bad at math. But I was talking to her about one of the things that really impresses me about younger people is that self-awareness. And like one example of this is I was just watching the Netflix movie, He's All That. Okay. So did you ever see She's All That?
I did.
Okay. So She's All That that came out my senior year of high school.
Okay.
So that tells you how old I am. I was the graduating class in that movie was my graduating class the same year. And so that movie for me is very nostalgic. It's very symbolic of, you know, high school. And for anyone who hasn't seen it, it's one of those kind of My Fair Lady sort of premises where he, on a bet, he says he can transform this nerdy girl into a cool girl. And then, you know, in the process falls in love. And so Netflix just came out with a flipped version called He's All That, where this social media influencer played by Addison Rae, who I didn't know anything about until the movie, but apparently she's like a big deal. So she does the same thing with a guy. She takes kind of a nerdy guy and then, you know, does a makeover on him. And there's this one scene where the nerdy guy has been nominated to be prom king. And all these different factions in the school that are kind of on the margins are excited for him because he represents them. And this one girl comes up and she's sort of, I don't think goth is a thing anymore. Is it? Is goth a thing?
Yeah, it's very nuanced now. So there's like, it's kind of shattered. So goth has become like an umbrella for like other different things.
Okay,
that's the best way to put it.
You're the right person for your job. The fact that you answered goth is very nuanced now. She had kind of that vibe where she had, you know, black lipstick on and she had, you know, a pale face and dark hair and, you know, spikes and all that. And she comes up to him and she says, if I were interested in, you know, who becomes prom king, like if I didn't think that this was a heteronormative patriarchal construct, then I would vote for you. And I saw that and I thought, this is such a great distinction between this generation and mine. Because and I thought, if you had shown me this movie when I was 18 years old, I could not have interpreted what that sentence even meant. You know, I would have had no idea.
Same. Yeah, totally.
And to me, it was really symbolic. I think that is a great example of how self-aware this young generation is in, you know, in some complicated ways, but honestly also in some good ways. I think that young people are thinking about systems of power and they're thinking about the nuances of identity, and they're seeing all of these things in a way that we were completely oblivious to.
Yep.
And I think that can have, you know, that can be blown out of proportion. I think it can become an idol in some ways, but I also think it could be good, you know, examining, you know, structures of power and how they negatively impact people. And so that is oddly very encouraging to me. And so when I was talking to my friend who's 23, I said, I really appreciate how, self-aware your generation is. And her response was funny because she said, well, with Jesus. She said, without Jesus, I think we can be just as sort of, inwardly focused and have a small vision for our lives as, any other generation before. But in her specifically, I see so much wisdom and understanding of, human dynamics that I did not understand when I was 23 at all. The things that I would say to people that was so insensitive and black and white, that she and her friends in our church would not do that anymore. They're just wiser in that way. And so that is really, really encouraging to me, because when I was young and I especially was growing in my faith, I just would say whatever I thought was true to people, and it was really hurtful. And it wasn't good for the church.
Yeah.
And so I'm encouraged that people are learning more how to be human to one another and compassionate, because we need that for the gospel to have credibility.
Yeah, totally agree. I've had people on here I talked with about, especially during election season or with racism, everything else. It's, how we say something oftentimes is as important, sometimes in certain contexts, more important than what we're actually saying. We can say the right things.
Yeah.
But if they receive it harshly, if they feel like the person saying it doesn't care about them, it doesn't matter what that person is saying. Okay, whatever. And that just fuels the ongoing, certainly online, but as we see now, even in-person polarization that just seems to be, that does seem to be widening. That's one gap that is getting wider, and that just adds to it. But yeah, the appreciation of the perspective, the wider perspective, the listening perspective, the taking in, observing, thinking about perspective of the younger generation is something that's very admirable. I definitely didn't. I mean, I'm still a junior high kid at heart. Sometimes I still put my foot in my mouth and say things that are terrible. But working with students over a certain period, you definitely see how they respond to things. And something that a student 7 years ago would have just died laughing at, the other student now is like, okay.
Yeah, they're like, that's offensive.
Right. And it is awareness. As much as we want to take into account, they're just fragile, they're just whatever.
I don't know. I
feel like when we're saying that, something I say every episode, I feel like lately, we have our horse blinders on. We're just focusing on, well, here's how it is. And God often works in the periphery so much that we don't see things. And if we don't have our focus on it, we're going to say God is silent, or no, my way's the right way. And if we just have awareness, if we just open those blinders a little bit, we should be humbled. Even if we're not looking for it. No one wants to be, but we should be, because we're going to find it.
Yeah, I think most cultural trends are a double-edged sword. The self-esteem generation, that was a double-edged sword where, yes, of course, people should be affirmed. Children should not just be seen and not heard. They should be cherished and delighted in, and because that reflects their heavenly Father. Should they be told that they can literally do anything if they set their mind to it? Maybe not necessarily. There's a double-edged sword, and I see the same with this, where there is very much this entrenched individualism where you can't tell anyone how they can live their life, and that is a problem. But at the same time, having the perspective to understand that I can't just speak into your life if I'm just a random person who doesn't have a relationship with you. Or maybe before I speak into your life, I need to try really hard to understand like how you came to that position or why you live that way. And so I see that as a double-edged sword as well.
I'd agree. Yeah, we have to be, I think that awareness has to come into play with weighing pros and cons and being able to navigate something that we can't change if it is it's in a certain if it's set in a certain way or a certain person has a background, we can still acknowledge things are detrimental. We can still acknowledge things are helpful. They could be really hard, but it's helpful. And if that's not a summary of the Christian life, I'm not sure what is. Self-denial, dying to self, listening, being humbled, constantly realizing how we were created for dependence when we're in a nation and a world that only cheers independence. It's something to be very aware of. Well, Sharon, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a really fun conversation. Conversations that kind of do this, to me, are a lot of fun because then they break into other conversations that can happen at other points. And we hope to have you back on here again, maybe talk about that book you have coming out next August. But thank you so much for your ministry. Thanks for your perspective. And I'll be praying for you and Bright City in Durham as you guys continue investing in the next generation there and making an impact for the kingdom. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Well, that does it for today's episode. Thanks so much for watching. All the contact information and everything else our guest shared about getting to know them and their ministry more is in the YouTube video description below. If you haven't already, please give our video a like. And at the end of this video, there'll be a spot right here to watch our last video and a spot right here to subscribe to our YouTube channel if you haven't already. Also below, there's a link to our website, youthministrymaverick.com. You can listen to all of our episodes, get some merch to help support the podcast. You can see a list of organizations that are there to help you in your ministry, see some articles that I've written, and some other things. I hope to see you back here on Friday for the next Fantastic Friday 5. And until then, thanks for watching. Adios.